All right. Hello, everyone. Welcome to Millennials Roll Podcast. And you know what, Brian? I've been thinking there's a new Exorcist movie coming out. And I think it's really interesting that it's a direct sequel to the first movie. There's been a lot of horror movies recently that have just started up 50 years after the original. And it's like, why would there be a new movie after 50 years of a movie not being made? It's just crazy to me. Like that Texas Chainsaw Massacre movie that came out. Who's thought about Texas Chainsaw Massacre?
There hasn't been any Texas Chainsaw Massacre since 1973, and all of a sudden there's a new one? What the fuck is that?
Yeah, and the Halloween movie or whatever, made by the guy who did Pineapple Express. And you know what? I was sort of thinking, wait, I'm just getting some information that there's actually more than just this Exorcist movie and the original. There's a bunch of other ones, actually.
No. Ellen Burstyn is in this new one. If there were other sequels, she would be in them.
That is true. I think the patriarchy stopped her from being in the other movies.
If there were other sequels, they would presumably feature actors that we know and love from the first one, such as Linda Blair, Ellen Burstyn, Jason Miller. I don't think he's been in anything else, so no.
I'm trying to understand what you're saying, Brian, but I'm getting some information that there's other movies in this franchise. I feel like Trump right now when he heard about Ruth Bader Ginsburg dying. He's like, I'll be honest, the first time I'm hearing about this.
I'm hearing about it for the first time right now.
But you know what? Let's talk about one of those forgotten Exorcist sequels. So for this week, we are going to be reviewing Exorcist 3. Now, Brian, this was your choice for this week's episode. Why'd you want us to review Exorcist 3?
This movie has been on my kind of long list for the show for a long time. I've liked it for a very long time. Saw it probably when I was about 11. My dad picked it up in the $5 DVD bin at Walmart, and I think we had pretty low expectations for it. And don't know if I was blown away by it right away when I saw it as a kid, but I thought it was really interesting and kind of disorienting. And so every time I would go visit my dad, I'd rewatch it. And I'd seen the first Exorcist, so I was kind of trying to grapple with this one. I don't know if I'd seen another horror movie quite like it then, and I still haven't. So I've always liked it. And throughout the years, I've seen it a few more times. It's a movie I like to show to people because not a lot of people have seen it. And I think a lot of people don't know what to make of it. I think a lot of people probably know about The Exorcist 2, which is nonsense. And it's very bad.
A very infamously bad movie.
Like, really is. And I like movies that are considered bad. That movie's insane in a bad way. And I think people hear about that, and then they hear that there's an Exorcist 3, and they assume that it's more of that. And it's really not, which is why I wanted to bring this up for here. This movie was made, I want to say 17 or 18 years after the first Exorcist film.
It came out in 1990. So, what's weird about that, right, is that 90s babies don't talk about this movie. You would think this would be a perfect 90s baby movie.
Well, the thing with this that's interesting to me is I think people that have seen this movie, people about our age that saw it at the right time, really like it. This movie, in terms of box office and its cultural footprint, is kind of nothing. It's kind of just like, oh, people love The Exorcist. It's this influential, beloved, critically acclaimed, commercially successful horror film. And then people are like, there's a couple of sequels. And this movie just kind of gets glossed over along with the second one. But I think people that see this movie, most people really like it. I think people who haven't seen it assume that it's really bad. And so I wanted to talk about it because I think it kind of fits in with a lot of what we talk about here. First of all, it's about the passing of time, right? It's about how time changes things. But also, I kind of feel like, so I rewatched this recently for Halloween. Like on Halloween, I showed this to a friend of mine. And I'd already been thinking about suggesting it for the show. And then upon rewatching it, I was thinking about how well the themes tie into a lot of this stuff we talk about here. And I was like, I don't know if Taylor's ever seen this. And I started reading a lot about it. And I thought it would be a really good subject for the show.
Well, you know what? Speaking of cultural impact, you know what? Let's just get into some details here. So, as I mentioned, this movie came out in 1990. It was rated R. Very unsurprising. There's a lot of violence in this film. It was directed by William Peter Blatty. The screenplay was also written by William Peter Blatty and was based on the novel Legion. And William Peter Blatty was, screenwriter. He wrote the original Exorcist, wrote the book that The Exorcist was based on as well, if I'm not mistaken, correct?
Yeah. So I'm pretty indifferent, to be honest, to the first Exorcist movie. I think it's really good, but I don't really get an urge to watch it much. I really like the book. Haven't read it in many years, but I actually think the book is really interesting. It gets into a lot of the kind of minutia of the movie, the characters' heads and stuff.
Well, you know what, Brian?
Yeah.
This might be sacrilege. This is the first Exorcist movie I've seen. I have not seen any other Exorcist movie, which I think you knew.
I think I assumed that you had seen the first Exorcist at some point. I knew you weren't like a fan of it, so it's good.
I'm sure it's a great movie, but I'm just not a fan of religious supernatural films. I just don't like them. So for me, that's like the preeminent like supernatural religious film. So I just have no interest in it.
I am a fan of supernatural religious films. I think they work really well atmospherically. I'm also not religious, which for a while, like I'd say in my teens, kind of I thought of as sort of a barrier to really getting into that genre. But at this point, I just kind of think of it like everything else. And what I would say about both this movie and the first Exorcist is the reason they work for me is actually because they are so extremely Catholic. And I don't mean necessarily in their theology, although they are, but like in their worldview, they're so Catholic, and it's really compelling to me.
That's totally reasonable. But yeah, just to me, the supernatural horror element to me just always is so goofy, and it just takes me out of it. I just can't take it seriously. And to be fair, I can't take a lot of horror seriously because a lot of it is inherently goofy, but the demon stuff is just inherently more goofy than anything else to me. I just can't take it seriously.
Well, and that's fair. So a lot of people, like, let's say people our parents' age, will tell you The Exorcist is the scariest movie ever, right? They'll say it's like, bar none, scariest movie ever. And it's pretty scary. Like, I do think since you're a horror fan, Taylor, you should watch The Exorcist. Not like, oh, you have to because it's such a masterpiece. I'm not trying to be like that about it. But just to see it, kind of, I guess, to see what the deal is. There is scary shit in it. There's also some really funny shit in there. Like having this little girl go like, "Oh, Jesus is gonna fuck you." It's like, that's not scary to me. That's funny. You know, like some of it's pretty disturbing. And the characterization in The Exorcist, much like in this movie, I think is really where Blatty shines. I don't really think of what Blatty's good at. And I'm thinking of this film, and I'm thinking of the first Exorcist, and I'm thinking of the Exorcist novel. For me, it's not so much that he's so scary, and he's definitely not like a Stephen King where he's so fantastical and interesting. It's more that he's getting really into the psyche. And I actually think that this film does that a bit better than the first Exorcist movie, because the first Exorcist, and tell me if this is part of your kind of disinterest in it comes from, is that the reason I think a lot of people think The Exorcist is so scary is because they're Christian and they think that it's literally a thing that can happen.
Yep. That is absolutely my experience with people who like The Exorcist and thought it was scary, is that they were like legitimate believers in like Catholic theology.
Okay, I've encountered a lot of those people. Those people are fucking nerds.
Very much so. Giant fucking nerds.
That's nerd shit. What I would argue is that is not the movie's fault, and the movie was made by William Friedkin, who seems like kind of an agnostic Jew, you know, it's kind of his deal, you know.
Well, I'm sorry, Brian was. R.I.P. to a legend.
He did it so he didn't have to see Believer. I swear to God.
I think he died like a week before it came out.
He didn't want to have to fucking talk about it. So back to Blatty a little bit. So Blatty is not primarily a horror writer, or was not throughout his career. He's a comic writer. He writes goofy comedies, he writes observational humor, and he wrote the second Pink Panther feature, A Shot in the Dark. He wrote the screenplay for it. So his actual bread and butter before The Exorcist, and even after to some degree, was comedy. So for him, actually the motivating factor to write horror were like his Catholic hang-ups. Now that sounds like it should be stupid, but for me, like a conflicted, kind of desperate, like a middle-aged Catholic, that is like the perfect worldview to write a like horror story.
Speaking of, let's just get through the details here, because I definitely want to talk about that in the synopsis. So this movie was produced by Carter DeHaven, getting back into the details here. And we mentioned, obviously, William Peter Blatty, his film credits and stuff like that. And Carter DeHaven is most known for producing this movie, the movie Hoosiers, and being an assistant director on TV shows in the 50s and 60s. I just included it in there. I had never heard of any of those fucking TV shows. So, and, you know, we were talking about, obviously, William Peter Blatty and his like and dislike of this film. So there's two different versions of this film. The original version is 110 minutes long, and the Legion cut is about 105 minutes long. Now, I did not watch the Legion cut for this movie. I only watched the original theatrical cut.
I intended to watch the Legion cut. I could not find it. And I was thinking that I actually have on the docket that I should read the book soon. Because like I said, I like the first Exorcist book a lot. Never read Legion. Couldn't find it. It was getting late last night. And I was like, fuck it. I got to rewatch the movie soon. So I just rewatched the theatrical cut last night. This is an instance where I kind of think that this cut is maybe not better, but at least a little more accessible.
The theatrical cut or Legion?
The theatrical cut.
Okay, no, that's totally fair. Maybe at someday I'll watch the Legion cut, but at least for right now, the theatrical cut. And we'll definitely get into our issues with the theatrical cut once we get to the synopsis, but I really want to save that because there's a lot of things I want to talk about in the synopsis here. And you were talking about box office wise how this had no impact. So this movie had a budget of about $11 million and it grossed $44 million. So a light little profitable film, but definitely not a box office gigantic success, obviously.
It said The Exorcist on it. It was going to make some money.
Oh, for sure. Absolutely. And speaking of critically, so this film has a 59% Rotten Tomatoes and a 57% audience score, which I think is honestly a crying shame.
Yeah, I'm a little surprised by that. We'll get more into why. I actually have never read any reviews of this film from when it came out.
I didn't do any research on that either. I didn't do my classic Ebert and Siskel look through to see what retarded opinion they had, but I'm sure their opinion was probably very fucking stupid, if I'm going to be honest. And you know what, speaking of maybe stupid things, let's get into the trivia here. So first trivia fact I have here is William Peter Blatty wanted the film to simply be titled Legion, which of course we mentioned earlier he did in his director's cut, just like his novel of the same name. The producers, however, wanted the title to be Exorcist 3 for commercial reasons. Blatty even tried to convince them to alter it to The Exorcist 1990 in order to distance itself from Exorcist 2 The Heretic, which he despised, but eventually they had to settle for Exorcist 3. Now, I can imagine why William Peter Blatty hates Exorcist 2, because even though I've never seen it, I've seen a lot of clips from it, and it looks awful.
Exorcist 2, when it was premiered, and it wasn't premiered like at a film festival or anything. When it was wide released, like across the country, audiences were laughing in theaters, and it was pulled last minute and re-edited to try to salvage it.
That is fucking bad.
Like, it is an almost unprecedented flop. Like, in just what a fucking catastrophe it is. It's so fucking weird.
God, Jesus Christ. And, talking about weird, the next trivia fact I have here would have just, I think, totally changed the trajectory of this film. But I'm so glad we got the version that we did. So William Peter Blatty offered directorial responsibilities to John Carpenter, who liked his script, but backed out when it became clear that Blatty really wanted to direct the movie himself. Now, I really think William Peter Blatty did a phenomenal job, and I think this was one of his only 2 movies he ever directed. Yeah. And honestly, he was a phenomenal director, because this movie has amazing cinematography to it.
The only other film, by the way, that Blatty has directed is The Ninth Configuration, which is also based off of a novel of his. Blatty wrote 3 kind of Catholic supernatural horror novels that are loosely called his trilogy of faith by fans. And the only other film he directed was a film in the 70s, Ninth Configuration, based on his novel, Twinkle, Twinkle, Killer Kane. Actually, Carpenter is the person, and this becomes very relevant later, who insisted that there should be an exorcism in the film. This is a sequel to The Exorcist, a direct sequel, but obviously the book was not called The Exorcist 3, it was called Legion. It's pretty different just in structure from the first film, so there was no exorcism in it. When Carpenter started talking with Blatty, one of their first conflicts was Carpenter saying, there should be an exorcism in here. Blatty did not want that, and I have feelings about that we'll get into. But I believe that it might be John Carpenter who put the idea in the studio's head that they should push for an exorcism in the film.
Yeah, once we get to that portion, I mean, we kind of spoiled a little bit, but once we get to that portion of the film, we'll certainly talk about it, because that is definitely, in my opinion, and I'm just going to say it right now, that portion of the film is kind of where the film lost me. I loved everything leading up to it, except that part. I'm like, this is a little too goofy for me. I'm sorry.
Yeah. We might not be entirely on the same page, but I am there with you. Like, I will get into why I feel that way. I have very mixed feelings about this versus Blatty's original vision. And I do want to make something clear, since we've talked a little bit about the director's cut. There is no proper director's cut of this film, unfortunately.
So, like, the Legion cut is basically just, cut together stuff.
From VHS dailies and some deleted scenes. There is no true director's cut that Blatty put in. He never got to that point. Like, I think the studio was too involved. And this is still largely his vision. I don't want people to get the wrong idea. When you watch this is a Peter Blatty film. But I think too early on, the studio started getting their fingers in the pie. He was getting a little too auteur-y for them. So he never got to the point of putting in that cut. There was a fan cut, which I could have watched. It's actually on YouTube. I almost watched it last night, and then I thought, well, I shouldn't watch a fan cut for the podcast. That just didn't seem right.
That just doesn't really make any sense. I'm going to be honest.
Yeah, it just seemed weird. From what I understand, the fan cut is like, this is before the Legion cut existed officially. So it was, I guess, a very well received fan edit that was meant to be like a director's cut. But I was just like, that's like a fan fiction. You know, I may as well pull up the Exorcist 4 fanfic. So I didn't do that.
Well, you know what, Brian? Speaking of Exorcist fanfic, let's get into my next trivia fact here, because that very much leads into that. So this film was a favorite of serial killer Jeffrey Dahmer. In interviews, he claimed to relate to the idea of an external evil being responsible for his murderous urges. Dahmer drugged his victims before dismemberment and confessed to a routine of watching this film with them while waiting for the drug to take effect. Also, coincidentally, he killed 17 people in the film, like the Gemini killer, although that was merely a coincidence. I don't think he genuinely intended to do that. But at the same time, I thought that was an interesting connection. And then also leading into my next trivia fact here. So the character Dr. Friedman, played by the actor Ken Lerner in this movie, played Joseph Zilber in the Dahmer Netflix show that came out last year. So I thought that was very interesting. And if you don't know who Joseph Zilber is, he was like a real estate mogul guy, big philanthropist. And after Jeffrey Dahmer was caught and convicted, he bought all of Jeffrey Dahmer's possessions and destroyed them so people wouldn't have his murderabilia.
How do we feel about like serial killer memorabilia? Do we feel like that guy did a good thing? Do we feel like he was virtue signaling? I mean, I kind of feel like maybe some of that stuff should have existed as historic, evidence. If you disagree, that's fine. I don't know what I'm talking about. I'm totally talking about out of my ass, and I've never thought about this before in my life.
Listen, as somebody who, I've lived in Milwaukee now for almost 10 years, I drive by places where Jeffrey Dahmer murdered people and where he lived every day for work. I really don't want murderabilia of Jeffrey Dahmer out and about, just for my own personal connection. I'm going to be honest with you. Like,
okay,
maybe other murderabilia, I don't have as much of a connection, so I'm a little bit more neutral on that. But I think for the most part, like, people collecting, like, I don't know, Jeffrey Dahmer's, like, fucking coffee table or whatever, that's just fucking weird. And I would stay away from somebody who did shit like that. I'm going to be real here.
Yeah, so this is not a thing I'd ever thought of before. So that's why I was curious what you thought. I've been thinking about now, I'm thinking, you're not like related to a victim of Dahmer's or anything, as far as I know.
Yeah, like I said, the only connection that I have is I drive by places where Jeffrey Dahmer murdered people and, he lived. So just seeing that every day, I'm like, oh, man. And people, trust me, have not forgotten about Jeffrey Dahmer here. They have not forgotten about it.
They'll come about when we're doing the synopsis, I guess. There are some kind of vague parallels to the Gemini killer and Jeffrey Dahmer, but I don't really think that's why he was relating to that character.
Well, let me tell you something. So here's another connection. So Tracy Edwards, who was Jeffrey Dahmer's final attempted victim, and he was able to get away, thankfully. I think he handcuffed him to the bed and he beat him up and got the keys from him and ran away, basically. But that guy claimed that Jeffrey Dahmer, while putting on the movie, basically preparing to kill him, he would do various incantations and mumble to himself, and he even put yellow contacts in because he thought of himself as the Gemini killer.
I read about that and it annoyed me because that means he's identifying with the demon at the very end. And if you were fucking cool, you'd be identifying with Brad Dourif. But he was getting the yellow contacts to look more like demon Jason Miller. Fuck off.
Well, you know what, Brian? He was a legendary alcoholic, so he was probably too drunk to even figure out what the plot of this movie was. Let's be clear.
That's classic Milwaukee style.
Actually, another fun fact, I'm going to stop talking about Jeffrey Dahmer after this, I promise. But so oftentimes his apartment just literally reeked of dead bodies because he was not very cleanly when he cleaned it up. And he didn't realize that because he was just so much of an alcoholic that he had actually lost his sense of smell. Yeah, the fact that Jeffrey Dahmer wasn't caught, I know we talked about this on the last episode, but serial killers, they get away with it so long, literally 99% of the time because of police incompetence. And Jeffrey Dahmer is the perfect example of that.
A distinction between the Gemini killer and Jeffrey Dahmer. Gemini killer, very clean.
That is also very true. He does not leave a single drop of blood at his crime scene. I mean, we'll get into that in the plot synopsis. And then my last trivia fact I have here. So in the dream sequence, both Samuel L. Jackson and Fabio showed up for some fucking reason.
That's so good.
And Samuel L. Jackson has a dubbed voice for his one line, which that's an incredibly baffling decision in hindsight.
I think it's an in-joke for Peter Blatty. That whole dream sequence, first of all, it's possibly my favorite sequence in the film. Second of all, this film and particularly that scene are loaded with cameos. I think because Blatty thought it was really funny. There's a very Catholic humor behind that I'll get into in the synopsis.
So yeah, speaking of synopsis, let's get into that here. So film begins in 1990, 15 years after Reagan McNeil's exorcism in 1975. Father Dyer, played by the actor Ed Flanders, not Ned Flanders, Ed Flanders, and Lieutenant Kinderman, played by George C. Scott, reminisce about Father Damien Cahrles, once again played by the actor Jason Miller, and Jason Miller will definitely show up at the very end of this film. I was not familiar with any of the Exorcists, so for me, a lot of these like flashback sequences and stuff, I'm like, okay, what does that relate to anything? Like, it just had no impact for me, but I'm sure that had impact for people that watched the first movie.
I'm going to tell you something. I'm still glad we're doing it. If I had known that you had not seen the first one at all, I might have waited on recommending this, because I do think that makes sort of a difference. I mean, the other thing is, if you don't like the first movie, it almost doesn't matter because this movie exists pretty separately. So that stuff only matters if you've seen the first movie and you like it, I guess.
Yeah, I think this is a sequel that, as far as I'm aware of, because like I said, I've not seen the first movie. I've seen plenty of parodies and snippets of the first movie, so I could probably piece it together from memory just from all that enough. But this movie, at least to me, seems like a movie that you could watch purely independently and have really almost nothing lost if you hadn't seen the first movie, if that makes sense.
Yeah, and that's correct, because that's how the book was written. The book was written to be, a sequel, but really more like a companion piece, I'd say.
No, totally fair. So, but yes, the following night, an incident at a church occurs indicating the presence of an evil supernatural entity, which causes a crucifix to open its eyes. I also loved that whole scene. There's a lot of amazing scenes in this movie that have like just various almost collages of various religious iconography that I really like quite a bit.
Rewatching this movie last night and on Halloween, I kept thinking about that scene where the Jesus statue on the crucifix opens his eyes. When I watched this for the first time with my father when I was 10 or 11 years old, he and I both gasped and jumped backwards. Thought it was the scariest thing in the world. And I talked about it for years. And then rewatching it on Halloween, I was like, that?
Yeah.
Really? Like, I was getting prepared to be scared. I was like stealing myself. And then the eyes opened and I was like, okay.
I mean, listen, if you're religious, I'm sure that's absolutely terrifying. But, as somebody who went to Catholic school for 9 years, I've looked at plenty of crucifixes of real life looking
much more
Jesuses.
Disturbing than that.
Yeah, right, exactly. And for me, it's just like, it is what it is. But so once again, the next scene then follows with the perspective of a man walking on the street, speaking of a dream of falling down a long flight of steps, suggesting that someone is committing murders linked to Cahrles' death. Now, I did think it was interesting that they showed a staircase. I didn't know that the Joker staircase was this famous. That's a bad joke. My apologies. Because obviously the staircase from the first movie, which is actually quite the tourist attraction in Washington, D.C., if I'm not mistaken. People go through it all the time. Yep. It's on the Georgetown campus, I think. But yeah, so the next morning, Kinderman is called to find the body of Thomas Kintry, a black youth that had his head replaced with a cut-off statue of Jesus. Also,
statue of Jesus in blackface.
Yes, in blackface. A lot of this early dialogue from Kinderman, once again played by George C. Scott, is delivered so incredibly that every line, I'm just like, what the fuck is he going to say next? Because I just wasn't expecting it every time.
He's so fucking cool in this. I love him. So I want to start getting into why, because I love this movie. I'm going to tell you, this is an all-time horror film for me. Like, it is definitely in the 90s. It's like, for me, it's in the pantheon. I don't know if it's better, but I like it more than the first Exorcist. It's one of my favorite horror movies. And I want to get into why here. William Peter Blatty has such a Catholic worldview, such a like American Catholic worldview, where he's like, the world is dark, it's bleak, and we have to believe in Jesus and God and Mary despite all of that darkness. It's not because of some sense of good, some sense of love and faith. I mean, of course, that's all there, sort of. It's the idea that the world is so bad. And that's what we have faith in, is the badness of the world. George C. Scott, our detective, our cop character, this is propaganda, by the way. He's getting to the point where he's seen so much bad that he doesn't care about God. This sounds really crappy, and this sounds like I'm talking about like The Reconciler. I know it does, but I'm not. Friends of the pod. So this murder, to me, it ties together all of these gross American feelings. So you've got religion, you've got like child murder, you've got like allusions to like historic racism. It's just primed to make you uncomfortable and to make you think about all of the bad things in both like our shared consciousness and like personal histories. And that's, I think, what Blatty excels at as a horror writer, is just a miserable, guilt-ridden worldview that is consummately Catholic.
That is the most Catholic worldview I could possibly fucking imagine. You surmised it perfectly. And also, I know I said I wanted to mention George C. Scott's dialogue in this movie. It's just amazing because like the first like 2 minutes he's in the movie, he talks about like, racism. I think he says the word WAP at one point.
To be fair, George C. Scott is, don't get mad at me, people. He's saying WAP ironically because he's accusing one of his peers of being a racist and not caring about the murder of this black kid.
Yeah, I should have made that very clear. Yeah. But it is very interesting because like this movie came out in 1990. I'm like, wow, this is primo white racism. This is amazing.
Oh yeah, that's the thing with Blatty, because he thinks about like ethnic white and like class conflicts. I'm not trying to say he's like a socialist or whatever, but like in the first Exorcist movie, before any of the horror begins, there's like the mother of Regan McNeil throwing a dinner party, and one of her guests, I see a producer or a director who is like French, and he's getting drunk, and then she has like a servant at the party who is like an older German man, and as this French guy gets drunk, he's like, oh, what did you do in the war? Were you a butcher? And he's like starting a fight there. So this is like a theme in Blatty's work, is like the conflict between Catholics and inter-Catholic group in drama.
That's so goddamn funny. All right, let's get back to the synopsis here. So the fingerprints at the crime scene do not match, indicating a different person was responsible for each murder. Kinderman reveals to the hospital staff, because he goes to the hospital, that the murders, which soon include Father Dyer, fit the modus operandi of James Veneman, or the Gemini Killer, a serial killer who was executed 15 years prior. So we're at the hospital. This is where most of the rest of the movie takes place. This is our like central location, is at the fucking hospital where Father Dyer is, and then of course Father Dyers later in the movie. No, that was terrible. My apologies. Kinderman visits the head of a psychiatric ward, Dr. Temple, played by the actor Scott Wilson. Now, I knew he looked super familiar. I'm like, I know where this motherfucking guy is from. I realized what he's from. He was Herschel Green in The Walking Dead, and as well, he was Leslie Vernon's trainer in Behind the Mask, The Rise of Leslie Vernon. And he was also in the very first scene of the Bong Joon-ho movie, The Host. So I'm like, oh, I definitely know who the fuck this guy is. I've never seen him this young.
So I was trying to think what I recognized him from too, and as soon as you said he was in Behind the Mask, I had to find him. I was like, oh shit, that is where I know him from.
Another Portland classic movie, Brian. I did not know that up until the other night.
I love that movie. Very of its time, but a horror movie that for me is an all-time favorite, although I don't know how other people feel about it.
Have you been to the Central Library where they did the library scene?
I've never been to a library in Portland since I moved here. I'm going to be completely honest with you.
Well, I mean, that's the thing. We were talking about all the crust punks that write reviews of Amoebix records. That's probably where they all hang out, is at the Central Library in Portland.
Yeah, someone's hanging out at the library in Portland for sure. No, God bless them. I hope they all get better, but, that is where they are.
But yeah, so Dr. Temple relates the history of one of his patients. The patient, played by the actor Brad Dourif, of course, he was Chucky very famously in the Child's Play movies up until the remake. And he was also Grima Wormtongue in the Lord of the Rings movies. Fucking phenomenal actor. Great B-movie actor.
He's in Spontaneous Combustion. Gives a phenomenal performance in that.
Yes, he's always somebody that honestly should have been an A-list actor, but he just was never able to get past that point, unfortunately.
I'm going to say it. I think he's a very handsome man, very charismatic. He didn't have the right look at that time to be a leading man. I think he's very attractive as a man, but I think that's what it was.
Honestly, if he was more famous in the early 80s, he could have been Tom Atkins. He could have been a sex god like Tom Atkins.
Since you haven't seen the first Exorcist, real quick, I want to give a little background on Kinderman and Father Dwyer's relationship, if that's okay.
Yeah, go for it.
So both of those characters, Kinderman and Dwyer, are both smaller characters, small supporting characters in the Exorcist novel and the first film. They're both friends of Damien Cahrles's, and they're kind of have a budding friendship in that film. So at the end of The Exorcist, Cahrles jumps out of a window for demonic reasons, killing himself to save Linda Blair. Father Dwyer, who is his close friend, is the priest who runs there to give him the last rites. So the subtext of that is supposed to be that the demon is like killing Cahrles. Cahrles is sacrificing himself for this little girl. And then the good of him is like living on in Dwyer, right? In The Exorcist, in the book and maybe in the movie, Dwyer and Kinderman briefly meet and they kind of make small talk and they say, oh, maybe we'll hang out and we'll see a movie sometime.
Hey, Brian, you keep calling him Dwyer, it's Dyer.
Dyer. Why do I keep saying Dwyer?
Well, you're thinking of Bud Dwyer. Nice shot, man.
I am. I totally am. But so in The Exorcist, Dyer and Kinderman both say, oh, yeah, like they realize that they get along and they're like, oh, we'll hang out and we'll see a movie sometime. So when you pick up to Exorcist 3, they are our main characters and they've been having this movie date. I think it's once a month.
Okay, because I had no idea. I'm like, well, great, they're going to the movies, I guess. I didn't know that connection.
That's a good callback because it's one of those things where you don't need to know that to get it. You're just like, oh, two old guys that are best friends. But if you know that, you're like, oh, okay, and part of their friendship implicitly is that they share the trauma of being friends with Damien Cahrles, who had this awful, mysterious suicide death.
Yeah, I'm glad you gave that extra context because honestly, when they were going to the movies and stuff, I'm like, oh, that's nice, but why is this in the movie? So I'm glad you mentioned that.
I mean, I don't think it's a thing where, like, if you don't know it, I think it gives you the necessary info that, like, oh, these two guys are best friends, they're grumpy old men together. So I think it's still good to have it there.
Honestly, I kind of thought it was a nod to another incredible George C. Scott movie that I'm sure we'll review on the pod eventually, but Hardcore. And it's like, oh, this is a more positive movie that George C. Scott is going to in the theater to see.
I would love to talk about Hardcore. I would love to talk about Hardcore, and I would love to talk about Network.
Rip to a legend, a very homophobic legend, but rip to a legend.
So I know he wouldn't identify this way, but looking back now, when we look at how far the party of liberals has fallen, do we make George C. Scott an honorary base lib? Can we do that? He's objectively not, but I'm saying based on being in Hardcore and Network, can we push that through? Can we ask our people and have them get back to us on that?
I'm going to have to take a rain check on him being a lib in Hardcore. He's extremely conservative in Hardcore.
Yeah, let's have our people run some numbers on that. We'll have our interns check that out and get back to us. I'm going to say George C. Scott, better than any millennial liberals working in politics right now.
That is honestly very true. But you know what, Brian? Speaking of very hardcore things, let's get back into the synopsis here. So we obviously mentioned the patient, played by Brad Dourif, was found wandering aimlessly 15 years previously with amnesia. He was locked up, catatonic, until he became violent and claimed to be the Gemini killer.
He was catatonic for the last 15 years, as of about 4 weeks ago, from the time of this film starting.
Yes, exactly.
He began claiming he was the Gemini killer.
But yeah, so Kinderman sees that the patient is his old friend, Damien Cahrles. Now you may be thinking, wait, you just mentioned Brad Dourif and Jason Miller, Damien Cahrles? Well, Cahrles' form appears to briefly change into that of the Gemini killer. He expresses ignorance of Cahrles, but boasts of killing Father Dyer.
I've seen other people with confusion about this. He is always physically Jason Miller. This is my take on this. It is always the body of Jason Miller. So, in the first interview, when George C. Scott, his first meeting with the patient, he at first sees Cahrles. And of course, Damien Cahrles is dead. Then, this man who looks just like Damien Cahrles starts telling him he's the Gemini killer. George C. Scott is, of course, skeptical because that's insane, because the Gemini killer was executed 15 years ago. And as they talk, here's my read on this. George C. Scott becomes more unnerved, and his disbelief becomes kind of untethered. At the moment, so George C. Scott at some point says, in response to the patient claiming to be the Gemini is dead. The patient screams, "No, I am not." And then that is when you see him as Brad Dourif. So my read on that is this is always physically Damien Cahrles.
Honestly, last night or I think it was maybe the night before, but either way, I was just sort of like, yeah, I'll be honest, I'm a little confused. Like, is Brad Dourif like Damien Cahrles or is it Jason Miller? Because honestly, I'll be honest with you, the actors look pretty similar. I was having a hard time differentiating them.
So there is a key line here. So after the Gemini screams, "No, I am not," meaning I am not dead. And then you see Brad Dourif. Shortly after, you see Kinderman is getting nervous. He's starting to fidget, And in that same meeting, Kinderman says, "I'm looking at a man who looks a lot like Damien Cahrles." And Brad Dourif says, "If you looked through the eyes of faith, you'd see me." So initially, he sees Damien Cahrles. But as he becomes more, maybe not convinced, as the kind of fear and talking to him gets to him, he doesn't see Damien Karras anymore. He's seeing the Gemini killer now. But the body is always Karras or the patient. Does that make sense? It is convoluted. I actually think in the film, it's always seemed pretty clear to me, but I've seen a lot of other people say they were confused by it.
Well, to be honest with you, your explanation makes sense. I just wish they had honestly, and obviously Jason Miller and Brad Dourif are phenomenal actors. I understand, but they really should have gotten two people who look massively different, because that's part of my problem. Because to be honest with you, like the only difference that one has curlier hair than the other. Otherwise, they look pretty goddamn similar.
So here's the deal with that. Jason Miller was not supposed to be in this movie. In the first cut of it, which again was never approved, that is, if I recall right, how the Legion cut looks, it's all Brad Dourif. Test audiences were upset that they didn't see any main characters from the first Exorcist film, so they kind of shoehorned Jason Miller in. Now, I actually think that was a good call, not because I needed to see someone from the first movie, but because then you get the cool thing of him at first looking like Damien Karras and then screaming, and all of a sudden it's Brad Dourif, which I think is a great switch. So it was supposed to be Brad Dourif. Blatty wanted it to be Dourif the whole time.
Yeah, now I have to watch Legion now because, obviously that's all been cleared up to me after I rewatched it for a second time, now that I was paying more attention. Because usually when my first viewing of a movie, even if it's, my pick for the week, I usually don't pay too much attention. I always try to focus on the synopsis and just sort of trying to make sure it's all in place. And then the second time I would pay more attention. But I was like looking away for a minute, and then I just saw him, like, wait, what the fuck? And it just like really threw me for a loop for a minute. And then I kind of figured it out at the end of my first viewing.
Well, and this is a movie, too, that is, like, very subtext heavy, and it's very, like, context heavy, I think. Because, like I said, I think people who've seen this movie at the right age, like, love it. But I know I've seen it described as pretty inaccessible a lot of the time, and I don't feel that way about it. I actually just think it's a really solid film. But I've seen a lot of people, including really smart people with good taste and who understand things, say they feel like it's pretty inaccessible. And I think that might be because there's so much text and subtext and kind of religious implication. And, like there's this weird dry humor to it.
Well, you know what? Speaking of subtext, the next scene here, I really want to fucking talk about. So that night, a nurse is murdered and Dr. Temple dies by suicide. Dr. Temple, who cares? But the nurse dying here, oh my God. I know everybody's talked about this scene, but this like 3 or 4 minute like setup for this jump scare is legitimately an S tier jump scare. And to be fair, I already knew it existed because I had seen it be talked about in a million retrospectives and a million top 10 lists and whatever the fuck. But even with all that, it genuinely kind of took me by surprise. It is incredible. Just the noise, just like the zoom in, obviously the guy with the garden shears, because we forgot to mention the garden shears too, because that's the murder weapon that people get beheaded with in this movie, is like garden shears.
I have a question for you, because you work in a hospital. I have a legit question. Why is that device in a hospital? Is that a standard tool? The decapitation shears? I'm being serious. What the fuck is that?
It could be an old school sort of amputation device, but okay. I don't think it would ever look that good if it was an antique amputation device, because most old school amputation devices just frankly look like torture devices. Interestingly enough, though, Brian, when I saw that weapon, it actually really reminded me of the game Clock Tower. I don't know if you ever played Clock Tower or not.
No. Is that the Cahrles Whitman video game? The Cahrles Whitman simulator?
That was a good reference. It took me a second, but I got the reference. But no, so in that game, the main bad guy, and in the first 2 games, although the third game is, trust me, watch some gameplay footage of Clock Tower 3 later. That game is fucking incredible. But so the main bad guy in the first 2 Clock Tower games is a guy called Scissor Man, who has one of those scissors as his murder weapon. And I thought that villain was actually based off of the garden shears as a murder weapon in this movie, but it was actually based off the 1981 movie The Burning. But honestly, it looks more reminiscent of this scissor. So that's why I thought that. So I was actually going to put that in my trivia, but then I looked it up and I'm like, oh shit, never mind. One last thing. So the murder thing. So once again, great jump scare. And then it also cuts to the decapitated Jesus statue with that like piercing noise in the background. Just perfect. Amazing filmmaking.
William Peter Blatty, he has a really distinct vision. One of the things watching this, I think that sticks out is he has a very distinct style that does not remind me at all of William Friedkin's. And he's only directed 2 films. And I'm pretty sure the only reason he directed them are because he wrote the source material and he didn't want someone else to.
Well, Brian, you said obviously a distinct style. Are you sure you're not talking about maybe a Roman Catholic, maybe an Italian Catholic film style that he had? I'm making a joke about this movie's giallo to a certain extent. Like, there's definitely some giallo elements in this movie, let's be real here.
So you actually brought that up to me yesterday. And when you were saying it initially, I'm going to be honest, I was a little skeptical. I was like, I don't know. But I rewatched it last night and I had that in mind. And you are correct. When you said it to me at first, I kind of had to sit with it. And I think it's the Catholicness, right? The vibe of this is so neo-Gothic. It's not classic Gothic. It's very modern. I see what you mean with the giallo thing. Just the cinematography. It creeps. It's creepy. It's kind of slithering. It's kind of seamy, the world that you're in when you're watching this, right?
Yeah, honestly, the tension in this movie, unlike a lot of more American-style horror films, is the tension is completely built up by the exposition and the dialogue, which is not a normal thing in American horror movies, but that was very common in, like, Italian movies. Like, those characters would just talk for, like, an hour, and then finally somebody dies. And you're just like, oh, fuck, finally somebody died. Some monster or demon or zombie comes out of the fucking background and murders people. And that's, like, a very giallo element that you, once again, don't often see in a lot of classic American horror movies. And now classic, you were talking about modern, but classic, like, 80s slasher films, for example, literally had a quote on how long screen time could go before somebody fucking died. But that's not a giallo film. They kind of take their fucking time.
This leads into another observation I had about Blatty as a writer and as a filmmaker. There aren't really on-screen deaths in this. This is a visual medium. This is a very visually compelling film, but the scares, primarily, there is that jump scare with the nurse, but even that is not, the death itself is not like hitting you on screen. The real scares come from other characters witnessing and describing murders, but you don't see them most of the time as the audience.
And that oftentimes is a giallo element, because even though a lot of giallo movies did have, like, gore and obviously stuff like that too, a lot of the horror was obviously implied in people's reactions to the horror more than anything else.
And the thing with people talking a lot, I think, has to do with William Peter Blatty is primarily not a filmmaker, but a writer. If you read the Exorcist novel, there's a lot of talking in it. Like, there's long monologues. That's like his thing. So I think when he's in control, he's like, well, this is where I shine. I'm going to go nuts, which is good. I'm not saying that as a criticism. But I think if this film had not been directed by someone who's primarily worked with the written word, there probably wouldn't be so much dialogue in it.
Yeah, no, I mean, you want to talk about the difference between a movie with lots of kills and no dialogue. I mean, obviously, I mentioned the Friday the 13th movies and 80s classics, but, like, fucking Friday the 13th Part 5 is a perfect example, because the guy that did that mostly made porn movies. He made pornography, so of course he doesn't know anything about actually compelling dialogue in movies. It's all tits and murder. So that movie's like the opposite of this movie completely.
So I'm a little more forgiving on the New Blood. That's the New Blood, right?
No, the New Blood is Part 7, I believe. Part 5 is A New Beginning.
Shit!
You know, Part 7 was directed by a special effects artist, like a practical effects artist. I can't remember his name at the moment, but he also directed the first Troll movie.
5 is the one with fake Jason, right?
Yes, that is fake Jason. That is the EMT who murders people because they murdered his mentally challenged son.
Just wanted to make sure that I was thinking of the right movie.
Yeah, Danny Steinman, rest in peace. He directed like 3 movies, and I've seen 2 of them, and they're not good. And actually, you know what? One more connection, though, is that one of his movies actually had an adult Linda Blair in it as the main character.
Which one? Born Innocent?
No, what the fuck was that movie? Oh my god, I'm having to look this shit up right now because I've actually never seen it. Savage Streets, that's what it is. That was one of his like 3 movies he directed.
She's kind of a B-movie queen in the early 80s and late 70s. One of her first films as an adult was called Born Innocent, where she is sexually assaulted in a shower stall, I think with a broom handle in the first scene.
Lovely.
I don't think you see it. I mostly know about that song because the band Red Cross did a song about it, so don't get mad at me. I've never watched it.
All right, but yes, let's get back into the synopsis here. So, Kinderman returns to see Cahrles, who once again changes into the Gemini killer. The Gemini explains that he is being aided by a master, the same entity who had previously possessed Reagan. Now, is that Pazuzu or is that somebody else? I can't remember.
That's Pazuzu. That's for sure Pazuzu.
The master was furious at being exorcised by Cahrles and is exacting its revenge by using Cahrles' body as a conduit for the Gemini to continue his killing spree. Each evening, the soul of the Gemini leaves the body of Cahrles and possesses the other patients elsewhere in the hospital, using them to commit the murders. The Gemini also reveals that he had forced Dr. Temple to bring Kinderman to him. Now, this hospital, it's a psychiatric hospital. You have a lot of people who are mentally ill. I think some of them just frankly have dementia, if I'm being honest with you. As somebody who works in a memory clinic, these people have dementia. It's very clear.
Yeah. So this might be kind of ableist of the film. I think the implication is that people with like dementia, like older people, that maybe their souls are easier to manipulate because they're not all there. Like they're easier for the Gemini to go into. I don't really have a problem with that, but I would understand if someone did.
You know, I never even thought of that connection. So now that you brought that up, I'm like, ooh, interesting. Although I will say that actually the portrayal of the mentally ill in this movie is fairly okay for like 1990. They did a pretty solid job, I would say. Like, they're just people who are just kind of fucked up. Like, they're not evil monsters. Like, you know what I mean? Like, and they're people being taken advantage of, which mostly happens to mentally ill people, let's be honest.
I mean, you don't actually see a whole lot of those people. There's, you know, a woman that you see quite a bit of, and there's some kind of, I guess, like black comedy about like her, but I don't think any of it doesn't feel really nasty or mean-spirited on Blatty's part.
Oh, and then also another connection is one I wanted to reference to you, because I think I referenced it to you earlier, but I don't know if you saw it. But at one point, Brad Dourif's character, like, oh, this is just child's play. And then it immediately hard cuts to a ginger child. That had to be on purpose.
Yeah, I was wondering about that too.
That had to be on purpose. I mean, come on.
I mean, and again, like, Blatty was a comedy writer. He has a real sense of, like, tongue-in-cheek humor. Again, that's why fucking Fabio plays an angel in this movie.
Although, to be fair, this was actually Fabio's first movie. I looked this up earlier, so...
He must have, by 1990, already been, like, a guy, right?
Oh, yeah, no, I'm sure Fabio was absolutely a thing in 1990. I'm sure of that. But yeah, this was his very first movie. He was uncredited, obviously, but still, yeah.
Hard to miss.
No, when I saw his face, I'm like, did the motherfucker put Fabio in this movie? What the fuck? He has a very distinct look to him, I'll just say that.
Oh, yeah. He's beautiful.
Yeah. But yeah, so the
Gemini... literally an angel.
Exactly, just angelic beauty. But, you know, speaking of angelic beauty, so the Gemini possesses an old woman and attempts to murder Kinderman and his family at their home. But the attack abruptly ends when Father Paul Morning, played by the actor Nicole Williamson. Now, is this a person in the first movie, too? Because, like, a priest just shows up. I'm like, why the fuck is the priest here?
No.
Just a guy that shows up doing Exorcist out of nowhere?
That is literally why he's here. Because they needed to shoehorn an exorcism in. He's like budget Father Marin. Father Marin is, of course, the older priest from the first film. The whole deal with Marin in the first Exorcist is that he's an older priest who has experience with demonic possession, so he comes in to help Damien Karras. This guy's just some schmuck. Generic priest.
Yes.
Tucked in to do an exorcism.
And I will say, and I know I mentioned this earlier in the review, but this honestly is where the film kind of lost me, I'm going to be honest. I was liking everything before this, and then the exorcism happened. I'm like, I don't know, this is too goofy for me. So I didn't like check out necessarily because there's only 10 minutes left of the movie. I mean, I made it 100 minutes. I can make it the last 10 fucking minutes, but I was just still like, man, this movie just took a fucking hard left into just to not being interesting anymore to me. I'm just going to be real here. And I think you said that was a John Carpenter decision more than likely.
Carpenter brought up the idea. He was like, oh, we need an exorcism in here. And I think that he might have put the idea in the studio's head, like, oh, yeah, this does need an exorcism. There's no exorcism in our Exorcist movie. Because there is no exorcism in the Legion cut. I know that. Okay, interesting. Because, yeah, the Legion cut's actually a little bit shorter than the theatrical cut. I do want to talk a little bit about Father Dyer and his death and kind of how that fits in. Oh, yeah, we totally forgot to mention it. So, yeah, Father Dyer, he dies by having all of his blood sucked out of him and being put in, like, little specimen containers next to his corpse. And no blood anywhere else, not even on the lid of the jars. So I said that the purgatory scene, the night before, Dwyer is found, Kinderman has this dream. It's a train station, right? This is where we see Fabio. This is where we see Samuel L. Jackson with a dubbed voice. Everyone has ridiculous angel wings. And the first murder victim, so this is like probably my favorite scene in the movie. It's very funny. It's very surreal and kind of like darkly tongue-in-cheek. This young kid who's, our murder victim runs up to Detective Kinderman with bolts in his neck because obviously he's been decapitated. And he says, "Hey." And Kinderman goes, "Oh, I miss you. I'm sorry you got murdered." Just very matter of fact. He sees Fabio. He sees a big band full of ridiculous cartoon angels, just like angels with big comedy wings playing big band music. He sees Father Dyer playing chess. I think he's playing chess. Looks over at Father Dyer, his best friend, and says, "I wonder if we're both having the same dream right now." And Dyer looks at him and says, "I'm not dreaming." At that moment, Kinderman wakes up to the news that Dyer has been found dead. He's summoned to go look at his body, where, we find, well, we don't see it. Kinderman sees it, and we see his reaction. That Dyer has had all of the blood drained from his body and, put into sample cups next to him very neatly, and has been decapitated without a drop of blood spilled.
And that also was very much of like a kind of like a giallo thing too, like the sort of like
the surgical nature of it.
The surgical nature of it, exactly. Yeah, the almost fantastical element of murder, which, I'm not going to say theoretically somebody couldn't drain the blood out of somebody and then leave their body with no evidence and stuff like that aside, but that is a very unrealistic way of murdering somebody, especially in a public place, like a very busy hospital. You know what I mean?
So one of the things with that dream sequence, which again is pretty much played for dark humor, is that I think Blatty, because he's a serious Catholic, had thought, well, I can't represent a true heaven. That would be wrong. I couldn't possibly capture the beauty of it. So instead he shows us like this ridiculous cartoon version of what I think must be purgatory, because that just would make sense for a train station.
Oh, yeah. I mean, Fabio's not making it to heaven. Let's be clear here.
No, although he does have those beautiful angel wings. So it's after Dyer's murder that Kinderman goes in to talk to the patient again. And I think by this point, although he's denying it, that Kinderman pretty much believes that this is the Gemini killer possessing Damien Karras' body.
Okay, yeah, no, that definitely makes sense there. And, speaking of, let's finish the synopsis here. So the master intervenes, taking over Karras' body, as you mentioned, and Morning is severely mutilated with having, like, his back skin ripped off. It's actually a pretty gnarly sequence. Not really like anything else in the rest of this movie, so yeah, it kind of comes out of left field. It's like, oh, we've had all these allusions to violence, and now here we are having a guy's skin get ripped off.
So, mixed feelings for me about the Exorcism scene. First of all, I don't like that they did it, because I know that wasn't what Blatty had in mind. This film isn't about a demonic possession. It's about a serial killer possessing a body. And to Blatty, because he's a Catholic, that would be, I don't give a shit. But to him, and the book he wrote, that would be a fundamentally different thing,
Oh my God, I just thought of something, Brian. Do you think that the writer of Nefarious based that movie off of Exorcist 3? That's basically what Nefarious is.
I'm 100% sure that Nefarious was informed by Exorcist 3. Like, I am sure that the filmmakers were at very least aware of this film. There's not a doubt in my mind. So,
honestly, I'm just going to say this. Sean Patrick Flannery, way better actor than Brad Dourif. I'm not going to say that, actually. That's completely incorrect.
Arguments for and against, for me, these final climax. So a lot of people feel like the book Legion and the Legion cut have no climax, that they basically just sort of end. I need to watch Legion to be sure on this. It is nice getting some fantastical kind of interesting effects. Like, the effects to me do look cool in the Exorcism.
Oh, no, yeah, honestly, when, like, the crucified fucking body with the sewn-on head and blackface and the people, like, holding it up out of, like, the underground, that looks really cool. And also, once again, that is a very giallo look to that.
It is, but it's very cool. It also looks like it's out of a different movie to me. It looks like it's from like a Nightmare on Elm Street film or something.
Yeah. Or it looks like an 80s Italian film once again, because honestly, I saw that and I'm like, what is this, fucking Lucio Fulci's City of the Dead? Like, this just looks a little goofy.
Yeah. So the one thing that I might save about the exorcism scene, because I do think it's really important to the film, I need to know if it's in the Legion cut, is so this whole time Detective Kinderman is like struggling with his faith or whatever. He's kind of at a point where he doesn't really believe anymore in God or Jesus or whatever. And while the exorcism is taking place, while this priest is mutilated, Pazuzu, now fully in Jason Miller's body, the patient, asks if he's solved Kinderman's unbelief. And George C. Scott has the most fucking bleak-ass Catholic monologue I've ever heard, where he says, yes, I believe. And he lists this litany of, he says, like, I believe in pain and torture and hate. and war and rape and slime and stink and every corruption and infidelity and all these things. And he's just screaming, yes, I believe. This to me is so Catholic. It's such an American Catholic thing. This is the whole thing I was talking about. The resolution of this film is not that our protagonist, through love and devotion and understanding, comes to believe in like Jesus or whatever and conquer evil or anything like that. He is so unable to deny the reality of horror and evil and hell and demons or whatever that he has to believe now. In this moment, as he's like claiming his belief in evil and death, the exorcism is completed and Damien Karras briefly gets control of his body and begs Kinderman to shoot him while he has that control. And then Kinderman shoots Damien Karras, his best friend, so that the demon can no longer inhabit his body. This is our happy ending of the film.
And Brian, you literally just finished my entire synopsis. But yeah, so that is the movie there. And then you were talking about how this movie ends abruptly. It just ends up with Kinderman watching Karras' funeral, looking at the grave. And I'm like, end, I guess. That's the end of the movie. Like,
well, I'm going to tell you, one of the things that I'm interested about with the Legion cut is that supposedly it ends more abruptly and it's more of a downer.
How the fuck do you end it more abruptly than the last 10 seconds getting a hard cut to looking at a gravesite and then no dialogue? How is it more abrupt than that?
Well, I'm also going to say people thought it was a downer. The first cut was more of a downer. So I haven't watched it yet. I really got to watch it soon. It's possible that just nothing happens to the Gemini killer, that he just gets to stay in Karras' body, and this is the end. Because realistically, that would be the end if something like this happened in real life. And it would be in keeping with this film's worldview, that everything is bad, the devil has all this power, and that, you know, we're just basically clinging to our purity in the face of corruption. This is the less abrupt and happier ending of the film.
God, that is insane to think about. Because honestly, when, you know, Kinderman killed Karras and all that, I'm like, okay, there's a little bit left of the movie. And then it just has like 20 seconds of that. I'm like, great ending, guys. You really fucking hit it out of the park with that one. So, granted, once again, I am not a ending purist. I know we've talked about this a million times privately off air. Yeah. I don't necessarily care how a movie ends. It doesn't even have to end satisfyingly, but it has to have a definitive end. And I'm sorry, the ending of this movie stinks. It fucking stinks. I'm sorry. There is just no other way to put it other than just like, it's unsatisfying. It's not interesting. I just think it's terrible. And I love the rest of this movie. I want to be clear. I think the performances are amazing. The suspense is incredible. I just love the tension and world building that it does. But man, they shit the bed on this ending. I just don't like this ending.
I don't really agree. I don't like the exorcism being forced in, but I do think that in the context of this movie, the idea that the world is just bad, I think it's, at least, if nothing else, it is consistent to say that the closest you can get to a happy ending is to shoot your best friend who begs for death.
No, once again, I actually like that part. I'm just talking about the literally last 20 seconds where they don't say anything and they just look at a grave. I think that shit stinks.
Yeah, I mean, I don't disagree. That's very abrupt, but I don't know what they could have added that would have made it better to me, you know?
I mean, honestly, I think of just a little bit more of an actual dialogue acknowledgement of something. That's literally all I'm asking. I'm not literally saying, like, fucking George C. Scott just has to go, oh, well, that happened. I'm not saying that. But, like, just an acknowledgement a little bit more than just looking at a grave and then cut to black. Like, I just think that stinks. I'm sorry.
So I propose that we edit in the ending line of 7, where Morgan Freeman says, Ernest Hemingway said the world is a beautiful place and worth fighting for. I agree with that second part. The exact same line, it works perfectly.
You know, in all honesty, I think even though that is hack, I think that is literally better than what happened in this movie.
Sure. So the thing that I don't like about this movie, and maybe it's just because I'm, you know, such a nerd about, like, I grew up believing in auteur theory, even though now I don't entirely agree with it, is that the exorcism bothers me because it's so tacked on. The ending itself overall, like, for me, that's the thing that fucks up the flow of the movie, is this fantastical battle between good and evil where this priest is mutilated and we see how open up, which again, I don't hate because it looks cool and it gives sort of an exciting climax to the movie. But for me, that's the thing that bugs me because it feels so out of place. Because
It
the rest of the movie is so understated. It's so understated and so tense and so about feelings. I mean, this is no joke. It's one of my favorite horror movies ever.
You know, in all honesty, that this ending kind of reminds me a little bit, and this is a bad movie, but talking about, you know, other people that have made Exorcist movies, Paul Schrader obviously made the 2004 Exorcist prequel or whatever the fuck. He made a movie a couple years back called Dying of the Light. That was another studio meddling movie. They completely butchered his movie, apparently. But the ending of that movie is kind of, the same thing. It's like about feelings and all this. And then the ending just has Nick Cage just murdering the guy he's been talking to the whole movie out of fucking nowhere. And it just comes completely out of fucking nowhere. And it's also maybe one of the most Islamophobic scenes I've ever seen in a modern movie. And that's fucking saying something. But either way, it's just one of those things that just comes completely out of nowhere. And it reminds me that, or it makes me think that Paul Schrader was just like, you know what, I'm fucking done making this movie. Just kill him at the end. Like, I really think that's how.
Yep.
And then it's not even the end. There's another like 2 minutes, and then he gets hit by a car, and then it cuts to black, and then he dies. Like, it's just like, wow, that was great. 80 minutes of buildup for this fucking amazing ending, guys. Like, Jesus fucking Christ. Absolutely terrible.
So, just as an afterthought here, I did quite a bit of reading up on this. Overall, it seems like people involved in this film were pretty proud of it, and I think they should be. Probably won't come as a surprise. Was a bit of a fraught set. A lot of tension between Blatty and the studio. Brad Dourif says it was very palpably sad. Blatty felt frustrated and at odds much of the time, but that he worked really hard to salvage his original vision as best he could. I feel like he did a pretty good job. It still feels very much like his piece. There is a pretty famous story I wanted to share about test audiences being upset with the film because, you know, it was too different from the first Exorcist film, which I think is why it's good, you know. It's not just a rehash of a little girl getting possessed, but I think maybe that's what test audiences wanted, and maybe even what the studio wanted. Blatty was discouraged by this, and at one point George C. Scott cheered him up by saying not to worry, because those people would only be satisfied if Madonna came out and sang a song at the end. And I just love imagining George C. Scott in his George C. Scott voice saying that. One of the things that's interesting to me, and I think gives a lot of insight into Blatty and his mindset, is that he was really bothered by how ambiguous the ending of the first Exorcist theatrical cut was. In my research, I watched an interview, a discussion between him and William Friedkin in the early 2000s talking about it, where Friedkin was kind of saying it's good for things to be more ambiguous. You know, people don't need to be told whether good wins or evil wins. And Blatty looked very sad and took a deep breath and said, I just don't want people to think the devil wins, Bill. And it made me feel so bad for him. So I think it's interesting to watch this movie through the lens of knowing that Blatty was upset that people might have thought that the devil won at the end of the first film.
That's so fucking hilarious.
Yeah, I thought.
And you know what, Brian? Speaking of the devil winning, let's get into some Amazon reviews. So I only have 2 Amazon reviews. There were quite a few Amazon reviews, but most of them were very long and most of them weren't very interesting. But I got 2 incredible reviews here, one positive and one negative. So the first review we have here is from Fryzilla, which I believe is the relative of Frylock from Aqua Teen Hunger Force, but I could be wrong about that. And the head of the review says, one flew over the Exorcist nest. And I'm sorry, there's a 4-star review. And the body of the review said, third time's the charm? In this case, yes. I'm not much of a fan of The Exorcist, but I do recognize it as a great film and one of the scariest films of all time, if not the scariest film of all time. Now, Brian, before I say it, this guy has heard of a specific scene from this movie. Where do you think this reviewer got that information from? Or I should say about the existence of this movie from? It's a certain online reviewer.
Red Letter Media?
Well, Red Letter Media have certainly talked about Exorcist 3. So here's the inspiration for why this guy wanted to review this movie. Or I should say watch this movie, then review it. I've heard a lot of good about the third movie, and it was on the Nostalgia Critics Top 11 Scariest Movie Performances.
He was very popular.
Listen, all right, I was a teenager at one point. I know I mentioned this a million times. I used to love the Nostalgia Critic, but the idea of a grown person who has an Amazon account enough to review Amazon movies, getting their movie recommendations in the year of our Lord 2023 from the Nostalgia
2023
is hilarious to me. Now, granted, though, actually, to be fair, I don't know when this review was written, but I don't think it was that long ago.
Well, I'm just glad more people are learning about this film, to be honest.
Totally fair. Listen, I'm not a gatekeeper of it. I just think it's very funny. I don't care if you like the Nostalgia Critic.
I mean, I think if you're past a certain age and it's 2023, you know, maybe put it down.
And, well, I definitely see why. First off, the movie completely ignores Heretic. I think we can all agree that's a good decision. And actually, no, you're totally correct. Thank God they didn't follow this up as a direct sequel to fucking Exorcist 2, because that would be a disaster.
Exorcist 2 is so weird, Taylor. Like, I mean, I can't overstate what a weird movie it is in a bad way.
Isn't James Earl Jones in it, too?
Yes.
Did he play like an African king or something? Like a pharaoh
shaman
or something?
Yes. A swarm of bees or locusts or something come out of his mouth.
Yeah, just absolute nonsense, man. Second, the movie has a more murder mystery vibe to it, which helps it give it more suspense and atmosphere. Third, Brad Dourif's performance as the Gemini Killer is just so creepy and unsettling that he's awesome, especially by the way he talks. Now, it's a very clumsy way to put it, but once again, Brad Dourif's performance in this movie is fucking phenomenal. I think you and I would both agree on it. He is, along with George C. Scott, they are the standouts of this fucking movie.
Oh, yeah. 2 all-time greats in this film. All-time greats doing all-time great performances, truly, in Brad Dourif and George C. Scott.
Rest in peace, George C. Scott. Friend of the pod, George C. Scott, who may be rehabilitated as a proto-base lib, but who knows?
Yeah, we'll retcon that.
Going back to the review here. Seriously, he is such a good actor. Plus, the movie has one of the greatest jump scares in film history, which, of course, we mentioned very much earlier in the synopsis. But once again, it is a S-tier jump scare. It's a phenomenal jump scare.
Oh, yeah. It's scary as shit.
Yeah, especially if you don't see it coming, that would probably make some people piss their pants. It's great. Even though there were some parts of the movie that made no sense, like the Jesus statue's eyes opening up at the beginning. I love how they pointed that one out. That's like such a who gives a fuck. Like, why did you even bring that up?
Yeah.
Or how Father Cahrles' possessed body ended up in a psych ward in a hospital. Once again, you just completely missed the whole point of the fucking movie. Like, I mean, what the fuck? Or there were parts that I felt were missing some important scenes. This is still a great movie. It's not as good as the original, but it's still a good scary movie to turn your head 360 degrees to.
There's a whole scene where the Gemini Killer in Cahrles' body, does explain that he talks about, and I know that this is covered more in depth in the Legion cut, but he talks about how upon being put into Cahrles' body as Cahrles died, it took him 15 years to work on getting his body working because his brain had been crushed to mush. He alludes to lifting himself out of Cahrles' coffin and having to kill the priest who found him, and then wandering around getting caught in the psych ward.
Honestly, a connection I just made, Brian. I think it's interesting that, so just like in Child's Play, Brad Dourif plays a reincarnated serial killer.
Oh, yeah. It did occur to me that he might have been able to use that to get this role. Because, they're obviously extremely different performances and all. They both have that in common, and they're both very much based on his voice acting. Even though he's in this movie physically, he's primarily doing, voice acting. Right?
Well, and of course, as we mentioned earlier, there is a specific reference to Child's Play in this movie.
Oh, yeah.
All right, so on to our last review here. Now, this is, along with the Wolf Creek reviews, one of my favorite reviews I've ever seen. This comes from the user account 7 Days, and 7 is spelled like the movie 7, and Days has a Z at the end. And they give this 1 star. Honestly, that kind of reminds me of, not a nu metal band name, but like a crunkcore band name.
Yeah, for sure.
But yeah, so they give this movie 1 star. And the head of the review says 1 star. And the body of the review says, get ready for this one. Didn't even order this whack-ass movie. Account got hacked.
Did he give the movie a bad review?
In all caps, no punctuation. Beautiful review. That's all I have to say.
I mean, if I logged in and I saw The Exorcist 3 had just mysteriously ended up on my account, or it just arrived in the mail and I didn't order it.
Oh, yeah.
I'd be a little freaked out.
You think Pazuzu did that himself. Yeah.
Yeah.
Oh, shit. But yes, those are our Amazon reviews. So let's get into our final thoughts here. So I'll just say my final thoughts real quick because I don't have very much final thoughts. So as I reread it earlier, the movie has phenomenal performances. I really like the build-up. I like the dialogue. The movie has very tense atmosphere, great cinematography, and it doesn't ruin the movie at all for me. But that last 20 seconds just falls like a fucking shark in my face. It just falls apart for me. But the rest of the movie, even the Exorcist stuff, is visually unique at least. But that last 20 seconds just staring at the grave, boo. That's all I have to say. Fucking boo. Honestly, if they didn't include that and they just ended it on Cahrles' fucking dead body gotten shot, I actually would have appreciated that way more, if I'm being honest with you. There's a significant finality to it. It's it's always finally over. And it is abrupt, but it makes sense at the very bare minimum.
But it would be just this harsh kind of ending to cut off there. Okay.
So yeah, those are my final thoughts. It's a great movie. I loved it.
I love this movie. It is one of my favorite horror movies ever. One of my favorite movies of the 90s, for sure. One of the things that really sticks with me is, again, everyone knows The Exorcist. Again, even people that haven't seen it know it pretty fucking well. This movie is a good sequel to it in that I think it captures a lot of the same themes and a lot of the same sort of sense of dread, but it's doing it in a different way. I actually think that this has potential to reach people who, again, aren't particularly fans of The Exorcist. I think if you're a fan of kind of true crime adjacent stuff, there's a lot that you might like here, and kind of, crime thriller things. If you like movies like Seven, you might like this movie. Of course, if you are a big fan of The Exorcist, I would recommend this, wholeheartedly. I would say don't be put off by the idea that it's a sequel and just think that it sucks. There's a lot of expansion on themes. There's a lot of world building that relates to the first movie. One of the things for me that I don't see people talk about enough is this is a really funny movie. Most of the film is dialogue, it's characters talking, and it's kind of us learning information about the story through characters' personal interactions. There's just really funny dialogue. I mean, there's jokes. There's like straight up jokes with like punchlines that work, and they still forward the plot of the movie, because Blatty was primarily, other than his 3 supernatural horror stories throughout his career, he wrote comedies. Just a really interesting movie. So I do like the exorcism scene. I think it looks cool and it's exciting to watch. I just think it clashes with the rest of the tone of the movie, and I know that it killed Blatty to put it in here. No, I love this movie. I think if you are a fan of like 80s and 90s horror, if you're a fan of supernatural horror or crime thrillers, I would recommend this movie. I think it's really interesting, and I'm sure that a lot of people won't like it maybe as much as I do, but I think it's a really, really good sequel. A really good film overall. I like it more than the first one.
Yeah, absolutely watch this movie. And especially, if you're a fan of like slow burn, sort of like dialogue heavy horror movies, this is a 100% recommend for me on that, for sure. All right, so with that out of the way, let's get into our pluggables. So you can follow me at Carlos Chantor on Twitter.com, otherwise known as X.com, but nobody's ever going to call it X.com, so you can follow me on Twitter.com.
Yeah, follow me on the website formerly known as Twitter X at John Stab. That's at JONSTABB. Don't follow me on anything else. Don't talk to me anywhere unless you want to send me money. You can send me money. You can send the show money. You can send us things you want us to review. Ask me for feet pics. Basically anything.
I will literally sell you my underwear online, okay? I'm just going to say that. Total digression, but I recently found out that, the YouTube channel Smosh, are you familiar with them?
Yeah, I am.
They were like the #1 subscribed YouTube channel at one point. But apparently there's a story that I just learned where one of the creators sold his socks to a fan in quotation marks, obviously, for $50. And that helped fund their very first camera where they like did most of their most popular videos. So that's a fun fact of the day.
How the hell are you going to be a professional YouTuber and you can't spend $50 on a camera?
To be fair, this was like 2005.
Okay, good. I was about to be pissed the fuck off.
Yeah. All right. And then also one last pluggable, and I know I plugged it on the very last episode. So Scott and Sean, obviously the filmmakers of our favorite film we reviewed, The Reconciler. I'm not even kidding. I think that's actually our favorite review that we've done so far. I fucking love it.
Cool guys, nice guys. I know we say friend of the pod, but legit, friends of the pod.
Legit cool ass dudes, and they have a new Indiegogo campaign / crowdfund for their Lucifer and the Father sequel that they talked about on our interview with them. It's currently going until I believe December 28th. I'm going to put it in the episode description. Please donate to it. They're only asking for $10. Any amount will do, but they're asking for at least $10, like I said. Cool ass dudes. I actually did like the first Lucifer and the Father episode. Please donate because I want to see more Scott and Sean content.
As they talked about when we interviewed them, it's hard to make a movie. I mean, we make fun of a lot of movies, but these are working guys who are just trying to make a project, and, they don't necessarily have the resources that, come on, do you want to see another fucking Marvel movie? No, you want to see Lucifer and the Father.
Yes.
You want to see Lucifer and the Father, and you want to compare it to The Exorcist 3 because they're both Christian films.
Exactly. And you know what? I'm going to say this unironically. The Reconciler is a both better film and an unintentionally funnier piece of media than anything Curtis Connor has ever done. I saw that recent comedy special. That guy sucks shit at comedy.
Oh, I'm sure. I don't doubt it for one fucking second.
All right. But yes, those are all our pluggables. Have a good night, everybody. And you know what? Don't let a demon possess you. I'm just going to say that.
Too late. Working on it.
Fuck. God damn it. All right. Have a good night, everybody.